It happened so fast that no one in the crowd even realized what they were seeing, until it was too late. Officer Greg Maddox, towering in his blue uniform, yanked his hand back and struck. The slap was loud and rang through the small park, leaving the crowd frozen in a silent gasp. The target of his anger was a young girl, a teenager who couldn't have been more than 14, and who happened to be sitting in a wheelchair. Her wide, terrified eyes stared up at him, a reddish mark beginning to form on her cheek where his hand had landed. And Greg? He was too lost in his own frustration and prejudice to notice the people around him beginning to pull out their phones, capturing every detail of the scene. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a deep voice cut through the silence, filled with a calm that masked a gathering storm. "That's my daughter." Officer Maddox's blood ran cold. He turned, squinting into the crowd, scanning the faces until he landed on a man stepping forward with quiet authority. Tall and broad-shouldered, the man was dressed in plain clothes, but everything about his stance suggested he was no ordinary onlooker. His piercing eyes held Maddox's gaze, filled with a cold fury that spoke of someone used to command. And then it dawned on Maddox, too late to turn back, who exactly he was dealing with. The man was Commander Bennett, a name whispered in reverence and fear across precincts far and wide. He was one of the most respected SWAT team commanders in the city, known for his strict code of honor and his unbreakable loyalty to those he cared about. A murmur went through the crowd, and Maddox suddenly felt the weight of his actions crash down on him. In that split second, he realized he hadn't just assaulted any kid, he'd assaulted the commander's daughter. Just 2 hours earlier, it was a sunny afternoon, and Angela Bennett, 14 years old and full of curiosity, was making her way to the local park. Though her wheelchair moved slower than her friends, she loved the park's open spaces and the sense of freedom they brought. She had her book with her, a gift from her dad, a book about strength, courage, and overcoming odds. Daryl, her dad, had always been her hero, though she knew little about his work in SWAT. He was always careful not to talk about the darker side of his job. To her, he was simply her caring father, the one who read her stories before bed and shared her love for adventure novels. Angela's mind wandered as she rolled herself over to the park bench. She imagined characters from her book coming alive around her, like superheroes in a secret mission. She didn't notice the murmurs from a few of the other kids, didn't see the disapproving looks from one of the adults nearby, Officer Greg Maddox, who was already suspicious of her, and for reasons he barely understood. Greg had spent most of his shift irritated. His personal grievances had built up. He had run-ins with a few young people at the park before, and somewhere in his mind, he'd lumped them all together. He saw Angela as another one of those kids with an attitude, though the only attitude she ever had was kindness. When Greg saw Angela, something twisted inside him. Maybe it was the wheelchair, maybe it was something else, but part of him resented her. He hadn't seen her do anything wrong, but he'd approached anyway, authority blazing in his eyes. He walked over to where she was sitting, intent on making her feel small. He began with questions, his tone sharp. "Hey, what are you doing here? Are you waiting for trouble, or just hanging around?" Angela looked up, a little confused but polite. "Just reading, sir," she replied, showing him the book. "My dad gave it to me." Greg scoffed, sneering at her. "Oh, really? And where is this dad of yours?" She hesitated, a bit uncomfortable. "He's working. He's busy," she said, her voice soft. She hadn't expected someone to question her or make her feel out of place. She thought for a second of calling her father, but she didn't want to bother him at work. She shifted uncomfortably, trying to avoid Greg's intimidating gaze. But Greg didn't let up. His voice grew louder as he insisted she must be there to make trouble, saying things she barely understood. A few people nearby had started to look their way, noticing his raised voice and her uncomfortable expression. Greg, however, was too far into his own tirade to see he was drawing attention. Just as Greg's voice reached its peak, he leaned in close and made a harsh remark. Angela's eyes filled with tears, and she struggled to find her voice. "I didn't do anything wrong," she whispered, her voice breaking. It was at that moment, in his frustration, that Greg lashed out, slapping Angela across the face. Back to the present moment, the crowd waited, breath held in shocked silence. Daryl's gaze was locked on Maddox, unwavering, his face betraying none of the fury simmering beneath the surface. Daryl Bennett held his composure, but only barely. His jaw was clenched so tight, he could feel the pressure build in his temples. His hands, rough from years of training and fieldwork, curled into fists at his sides. He took a slow, measured breath, just as he would on any SWAT mission, forcing himself to remain calm, even as the rage surged through him. For a moment, Officer Maddox stared back, frozen in place, as though he couldn't quite believe what was happening. He didn't know what to say, and his face flushed under the intensity of Daryl's stare. Slowly, the color drained from his cheeks, as the reality of the situation sank in. He'd had just laid hands on the daughter of a man who commanded respect from the toughest officers in the entire department. "Sir, I didn't realize," Maddox stammered. But the words felt hollow, even to him. Daryl took a step forward, his voice like ice. "That's my daughter you just hit." His words cut through the silence, and Maddox shrank back as the crowd murmured again. Phone cameras were still pointed at them, recording every moment, and Maddox couldn't escape the intensity of their stares. The weight of his own actions pressed down on him like a leaden cloak. Angela looked up at her father, a mixture of relief and fear in her eyes. She had never seen her dad like this, and for a second, she wasn't sure if he would yell, demand justice, or simply walk away with her. But as she glanced at Maddox, the redness of her cheek throbbing, she realized that what happened next wasn't really in her control. This was between her dad and Officer Maddox now. 1 week earlier, Angela's excitement buzzed in the air. She had been counting down the days to Saturday, her and her dad's special day together. It had become a tradition of sorts since her mom passed away, a way for them to bond and make new memories. Her dad would take her somewhere special, usually a park, a museum, or a bookstore, and they'd spend hours exploring, sharing stories, and laughing. He was strict, for sure, but Angela knew it came from a place of deep love and of fierce protectiveness. Daryl never talked much about his work as a SWAT commander. Whenever Angela asked, he'd smile and say, "One day when you're older." She would pout and protest, trying to get him to tell her something exciting. But he'd always managed to sidestep the question. She knew his job was dangerous. She'd seen the way he'd come home sometimes, tired and quiet, though he'd always light up as soon as he saw her. On that particular Saturday, Angela had noticed her dad was more serious than usual. He had taken a call earlier that morning, his voice low and tense. When he'd hung up, she had heard him mutter something under his breath, something she couldn't quite make out. But as soon as he saw her, he'd forced a smile, and they headed out for their day together. She didn't ask questions. She was just happy to spend time with him. They went to the park, and Angela noticed the nervous glances her dad exchanged with other officers. She brushed it off, telling herself it was just another part of his job she didn't quite understand. She spent the day soaking up the warmth of the sun, reading her book while her dad watched nearby, his eyes scanning the area with a sense of alertness that was second nature to him. But that Saturday was different for another reason, too. Angela had seen Officer Maddox for the first time. She only caught a brief glimpse of him, standing near his patrol car, talking to another officer. There was something in the way he looked at her that made her uneasy, a hard, judgmental stare that seemed to linger just a second too long. She remembered shifting in her wheelchair, wondering if she'd done something wrong. She'd looked to her dad for reassurance, but by then, he was focused on his conversation, unaware of Maddox's gaze. In the days that followed, Angela couldn't shake that uncomfortable feeling. She'd seen Maddox in the park a few more times, each encounter leaving her with a sense of dread she couldn't explain. She tried to brush it off, telling herself she was overreacting. But deep down, she felt uneasy, like something wasn't quite right. Back to the present. Daryl's voice was steady, but there was a deadly calm to it that made the crowd step back, giving him and Maddox a wide berth. He took another step forward, closing the distance between himself and Maddox, until they were just inches apart. His eyes, normally warm and full of life, were now cold and unreadable. "You think this is just another kid you can push around?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. But the intensity made Maddox shrink even further. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Maddox swallowed hard, his mind racing, but he was too rattled to respond. "Answer me," Daryl said, his tone sharper this time, like the snap of a whip. Maddox cleared his throat, his voice shaky. "Commander Bennett, I'm sorry, sir. I didn't know she was your daughter." Daryl's eyes narrowed. Would that have made a difference? His words were a challenge, one that sent a shiver down Maddox's spine. He knew there was no good answer to that question. Whether or not Angela was Daryl's daughter shouldn't have mattered. But in this moment, he realized his prejudice had led him to make a grave mistake. Angela, still seated in her wheelchair, watched her dad, both relieved and worried. She had never seen this side of him, this fierce, unyielding force that seemed almost unbreakable. But as she looked at Maddox, she felt a strange mix of pity and anger. She wanted justice, yes, but she also didn't want her father to get into trouble over what had happened. Maddox took a step back, hands up in a defensive gesture. "Look, sir, this is all a misunderstanding. I didn't mean to. I didn't realize." "Didn't realize what?" Daryl's voice was steady, and the quiet calm in his tone only added to the tension in the air. "That she was black, disabled, or my daughter?" Maddox stammered, his words tumbling over each other as he struggled to find an answer that wouldn't make things worse. The crowd was silent, waiting, their eyes moving from Daryl to Maddox, back and forth, as though watching a high-stakes standoff. "Sir, please, Maddox began, but Daryl cut him off, his voice like steel. "You should be ashamed, not just as a cop, but as a human being." The crowd murmured in agreement, nodding, a few people even clapping quietly. Maddox's face burned with humiliation, but he didn't dare speak. He had gone too far, and he knew it. Daryl finally turned to Angela, kneeling down beside her and gently cupping her face in his hands. His eyes softened, and his voice returned to the warm, familiar tone she knew so well. "You okay, sweetie?" he asked softly, wiping a tear from her cheek. Angela nodded, sniffling. "I'm okay, Daddy," she whispered, her voice shaky. She glanced nervously at Maddox, still hovering nearby, unsure of what her father would do next. Daryl turned back to Maddox, rising to his full height. "You're coming with me to the station," he said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. "This isn't over." The crowd parted as Daryl guided Angela away from Maddox, but just as they turned to leave, Maddox made one last desperate attempt to defend himself. "Commander, please. I didn't mean for this to happen. Can't we just let this go?" Daryl's back stiffened. He stopped, his voice so quiet it was barely audible. "Let this go." He turned back, his eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You think justice is something we can just let go?" And with that, Daryl led Angela away, leaving Maddox standing alone in the middle of the crowd, his career and reputation hanging by a thread. As they walked toward the station, Angela looked up at her dad, her voice small. "What's going to happen to him, Daddy?" Daryl's face softened as he looked down at her. "Justice, Angela," he said gently. "Justice is what happens next." But in the back of his mind, he knew this was only the beginning of a battle that might cost him more than he was prepared to lose. Daryl Bennett knew the ride to the station would be tense. He drove in silence, his mind racing with thoughts of what had just happened. Angela sat beside him, clutching her book close to her chest. She always loved that book, an adventure story about overcoming odds, one that her dad had given her on her last birthday. Today, though, her imagination was miles away from those fictional heroes. They arrived at the station, and as soon as they stepped through the doors, every head turned in their direction. Officer Maddox, escorted by two other officers, trailed in reluctantly behind them, his face pale and drawn. The room grew quiet as everyone looked from Daryl to Maddox, whispering among themselves. Captain Lisa Turner, head of the precinct and one of Daryl's oldest friends, stepped out from her office, her sharp gaze taking in the scene. She took one look at Maddox, who was barely holding it together, then at Daryl and Angela. Her expression shifted, showing a mixture of surprise and a deep, simmering anger. "Daryl, in my office." "Now," she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for debate. Daryl placed a reassuring hand on Angela's shoulder, whispering, "I'll be right back, okay?" She nodded, trying to stay calm, as she found a seat by the desk of one of the younger officers, who handed her a bottle of water and a gentle smile. Inside Captain Turner's office, Daryl shut the door and took a deep breath. Lisa looked at him, her eyes flashing. "Daryl," she began, her voice calm but serious. "What's going on?" "Greg Maddox hit my daughter," Daryl replied simply, his voice steady. For a moment, Lisa's expression froze, and then a flicker of anger crossed her face. She didn't need more explanation. She'd known Maddox's temper, knew that he had a few warnings in his file for excessive behavior, though never anything so blatant. "This isn't the first complaint against him," Lisa said after a long pause, her voice tight. "But this This is different. Daryl nodded. I want him off the force, Lisa. I don't care what strings need to be pulled. He can't get away with this. Lisa held his gaze, her expression unreadable. She understood the stakes, both as a captain and as a friend. But in a police department with a reputation to uphold, things were rarely simple. Daryl, you know as well as I do that this isn't going to be easy, she said softly, almost apologetically. The department will want to handle this quietly. They'll say it's protocol. Try to keep it out of the spotlight, she sighed, leaning back in her chair. But with the cameras and the witnesses, they won't be able to brush this one under the rug. Daryl's expression hardened. Then they'll have to make it right, and I'm not backing down. Lisa nodded, understanding the unspoken words between them. She glanced at the door, her face softened for a moment. And Angela? How's she handling this? Daryl's eyes softened. She's tough, but no kid should have to be tough in the face of something like this. Lisa sat back, thoughtful, then straightened up, her professional demeanor returning. I'll make sure the investigation is thorough, Daryl. No shortcuts. I'll get Maddox's record pulled, and we'll talk to every witness we can. But it's going to get messy. Daryl nodded, appreciating her support, even if it came with challenges. I'm ready for messy. Lisa gave him a firm nod, then gestured to the door. Go be with your daughter. I'll handle things from here. As Daryl stepped out of the office, Angela looked up from her seat, her expression anxious. She'd overheard bits and pieces of the conversation from where she was sitting, enough to understand that her dad was trying to make sure that Maddox faced the consequences of what he did. She smiled faintly when she saw him, but he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. Come on, sweet, he said, his voice gentle as he guided her towards the exit. Let's go home. As they made their way out, they passed Maddox again, who was now sitting in an interrogation room, slumped in his chair with his head in his hands. He looked up briefly, and for a split second, their eyes met. Daryl's gaze was cold and unwavering, and Maddox quickly looked away. The following day, Angela woke up to the soft hum of the morning news playing from the kitchen. She rolled her wheelchair toward the doorway, her eyes widening as she caught sight of her dad standing by the counter, his gaze fixed on the television screen. The newscaster's voice was calm, but the story being told was anything but ordinary. Yesterday, a video surfaced showing a uniformed officer, identified as Greg Maddox, slapping a disabled black teenager in a local park. Witnesses claim that the young girl was approached without provocation and subjected to what can only be described as an unprovoked attack. The footage from the park played on screen, and Angela's face flushed with embarrassment and sadness as she watched. But her father turned to her, his expression kind and reassuring. You okay? He asked gently. She nodded, though the knot in her stomach told her otherwise. She was a bit afraid of going back to the park, worried she might run into more people who would look at her differently, who would remember her as the girl from the news. But she pushed those feelings aside. Her dad had always taught her to be brave, and she knew she would do her best. Daryl poured her a glass of orange juice, then took a seat at the table across from her. It's going to be okay, he said softly, reaching out to hold her hand. People are going to say a lot of things, but I'll be right here. You're safe. Angela managed a small smile, grateful for his words, but in the back of her mind, she couldn't help wondering what would happen next. She'd overheard enough at the station to know her father was determined to see Maddox punished, but she didn't fully understand the implications, how much this battle could cost him. At the precinct, Maddox had spent the night in holding. He hadn't anticipated that things would spiral out of control so quickly. In his mind, he thought it would all blow over, that people would forget about it in a week. But as the news coverage spread, he began to realize how serious the situation was. His reputation, his career, all of it was in jeopardy, and he felt like he was drowning. He was finally brought to an interrogation room the next morning, where Captain Turner waited for him. Her expression was cool, professional, though Maddox could sense the disappointment in her eyes. Officer Maddox, she began, her voice steady. I'll make this simple. The department has received a formal complaint from Commander Bennett, and you'll be put on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. Maddox's face paled. Captain, please, it was a misunderstanding, he said desperately. I didn't mean to hurt her. Lisa sighed, her gaze steely. Your intentions are irrelevant. Greg, you assaulted a minor, and not just any minor, a disabled young girl who happened to be the daughter of one of our most respected commanders. But Captain, if I lose my job. Maddox's voice trailed off, panic creeping into his tone. Lisa cut him off with a hard look. Maybe it's time you think about the impact your actions have on others, Greg. This is about accountability, and no one is above that, least of all someone with a badge. Maddox fell silent, his mind spinning as he realized that his words held little weight here. Lisa turned to leave, pausing briefly by the door. The public is watching, Greg, and this time, they're not going to let this slide. As she walked away, Maddox slumped in his chair, his mind swirling with a mixture of regret and fear. He couldn't escape the feeling that his life, as he knew it, was slipping through his fingers. Back at home, Daryl and Angela had spent the day together, trying to put the events of the previous day behind them. They watched a movie, played a board game, and Daryl even made Angela's favorite grilled cheese sandwiches for lunch. It was a simple day, but Daryl could see how much Angela needed the distraction. Just as they were clearing up dinner, Daryl's phone rang. He recognized the number. It was Captain Turner. "Daryl," Lisa's voice came through, calm, but with a hint of urgency. "You need to come to the station. We've received some troubling reports." Daryl's heart skipped a beat. "What kind of reports?" "Threats," she replied quietly. "Against Angela and you. We don't know who's behind them yet, but I thought you should know." Daryl clenched his jaw, a surge of protective anger flaring up inside him. He looked over at Angela, who was still happily finishing her dinner, unaware of the new storm brewing around them. "I'll be there soon," he replied, his voice steady. Hanging up, he turned to Angela, his mind racing. For a brief moment, he considered not telling her, shielding her from the truth. But then he took a breath, knowing that she deserved honesty, even if it meant facing more difficult truths. With a new challenge on the horizon, Daryl realized that the fight wasn't just about justice. It was about protecting his family. And as he held Angela's hand, a fierce resolve settled over him. Daryl walked into the precinct that night, his face set in a steely expression as he pushed through the revolving doors. His mind churned over the captain's words. Threats. It was one thing to deal with injustice. It was another entirely when his family's safety was on the line. He had expected some pushback, whispers among his colleagues maybe, but not this level of hostility. The precinct was quieter than usual. A few officers nodded at him as he passed, though he could sense the tension in their eyes. The way conversations fell silent when he drew near. Word of what had happened with Maddox had traveled fast, and the reality of facing a brother in arms made things uncomfortable for everyone. As he reached Captain Turner's office, she was already waiting for him by the door, her face a mixture of determination and concern. "Daryl, thanks for coming in so quickly," she said, gesturing him inside. He followed her in, noticing a stack of files on her desk, along with a small recording device and a laptop screen showing security footage. Clearly, she'd been busy. "Let's get straight to it," Lisa began, taking a seat and motioning for him to do the same. She clicked on a few folders on her screen, then paused, looking him in the eye. "We've received multiple calls. Some have been anonymous and others, well, let's just say some people didn't feel the need to hide their identities." She clicked a button, and the voice recording began to play. The voice was muffled, filtered through some voice-distorting app, but the words were unmistakably threatening. "Bennett better back off, or there will be consequences for him and his girl. Nobody wants to see things get ugly. Take care of your own, Bennett, before you lose her." The recording clicked off, and a heavy silence filled the room. Daryl's jaw clenched as he leaned forward, eyes locked onto the screen. He'd dealt with threats before, but hearing someone target Angela, that was an entirely different matter. He felt a protective rage swell inside him, mixed with a cold, unwavering focus. Whoever was behind this would regret it. Lisa cleared her throat. That was just the first call. There were a couple more, all with similar messages. She glanced down at her notes, then looked back up at Daryl, her face grim. "The fact that they're going after Angela specifically, it tells me this isn't just about Maddox. There's something deeper going on here, and whoever's behind it has powerful connections." Daryl nodded slowly, his mind racing. "Are there any leads?" "Not yet, but we've started running voice matches on anyone with a record of misconduct complaints." And Daryl, she paused, her eyes narrowing. "I think it's time to consider additional protection for you and Angela." Daryl shook his head. "I can handle myself, Lisa. And Angela's with me every step of the way. No one's getting close to her. Lisa frowned, clearly not satisfied. Look, I understand how capable you are, Daryl, but you're too close to this situation. Your judgment might be affected. Daryl met her gaze, his expression hard. My judgment is as clear as ever, Lisa. They went after my daughter. If anything, that makes me even more determined to see this through. Lisa sighed, nodding reluctantly. I get it, believe me. Just stay alert. We'll put extra patrols in your neighborhood, and I'll have an undercover officer near Angela's school, just in case. Daryl took a steadying breath. Thanks, Lisa. I appreciate it. He rose to his feet, his mind already focused on the next steps. He would find whoever was behind this, and make sure they paid. The next morning, Angela sat at the breakfast table, staring at her cereal as if it held the answers to all her questions. Her dad had seemed different lately, more intense, and though he tried to hide it, she could sense the worry lurking behind his reassuring smiles. The incident with Maddox weighed heavily on her, but it was the look in her father's eyes that haunted her most. She had never seen him so distant. Daddy? She asked softly, looking up as he poured himself a cup of coffee. Are we going to be okay? Daryl turned to her, his face softening as he met her worried gaze. He set the coffee down and walked over, kneeling beside her so they were eye level. Angela, sweetheart, he said gently, taking her hand. We're going to be just fine. I promise. She nodded, her expression uncertain. But what about the people who are angry? The ones who are saying bad things about us? Daryl's heart twisted as he thought about the threats. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice calm and reassuring. Some people are angry because they don't like that we're standing up for what's right, but we can't let them scare us. We have to be strong, okay? Angela nodded, though he could see the worry lingering in her eyes. She was trying so hard to be brave, and he felt a surge of pride, mixed with a fierce determination to protect her at all costs. I love you, Daddy, she whispered, squeezing his hand. I love you too, sweetheart, he replied, pulling her into a hug. He held her close, vowing silently that he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. Later that day, as Daryl drove Angela to school, he noticed an unfamiliar car parked near the entrance, its windows tinted darkly. His instincts kicked in, and he slowed down, taking a mental note of the license plate and keeping an eye on the driver. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was off. Angela noticed his expression and glanced at the car. Is everything okay, Daddy? Daryl forced a smile, nodding. Everything's fine, sweetie. Just making sure you're safe. He waited until she had safely entered the school building, then circled back, watching the car as it pulled away slowly. It could have been nothing, but Daryl knew better than to ignore his instincts. As he drove to the precinct, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Lisa. Daryl, we've got something. Surveillance footage shows Maddox meeting with a man who's been under investigation for corruption. Looks like he might not be working alone. Daryl's pulse quickened. This was exactly the lead he needed. If Maddox had connections to someone powerful, someone willing to threaten his family to protect him, then things were more serious than he'd imagined. Arriving at the station, Daryl went straight to Lisa's office, where she was waiting with a file open on her desk. She looked up as he entered, motioning for him to close the door. Take a look at this, she said, sliding the file toward him. Inside were photos of Maddox in what appeared to be a clandestine meeting with a man Daryl instantly recognized, Paul Regan, a wealthy businessman with ties to multiple scandals. Regan had always managed to slip through the cracks, using his money and influence to avoid any real consequences. If he was involved with Maddox, it explained a lot. Lisa crossed her arms, her expression serious. We think Regan might be bankrolling Maddox, or at the very least, supporting him in exchange for favors. This could go deeper than we thought. Daryl's expression darkened. If Regan's involved, he won't just sit back and let us expose him. He's going to push back hard. Lisa nodded, her eyes narrowing. That's why we need to be careful. If Maddox is working under Regan's orders, then the threats to you and Angela, they're likely from him as well. Daryl clenched his fists, a new resolve hardening in him. He had faced dangerous people before, but Regan's involvement meant this was no ordinary case of misconduct. This was corruption on a higher level, and it put him and his family directly in harm's way. Then we bring Regan down, Daryl said, his voice steady. "We gather evidence, and we don't stop until we have enough to take them both out of the picture." Lisa nodded, her expression fierce. "Agreed. But we're going to have to tread carefully. Regan's reach is long, and he has friends in high places. This won't be easy." Daryl gave her a determined look. "I don't care how long it takes. He threatened my daughter, Lisa. This is personal now." Lisa met his gaze, nodding in silent understanding. "Then let's get to work." Back at home that night, Daryl sat in his study, poring over the case files and notes, formulating a plan. But as he worked, he heard a faint sound outside, a low, rumbling engine. He stood, moving to the window, and his heart sank as he saw the same car with dark-tinted windows parked across the street, its engine idling. He stepped away from the window, taking a deep breath to steady himself. The stakes had just been raised, and he knew he had no choice but to see this through. His family's safety depended on it, and he would do whatever it took to protect them. The battle was only beginning, and Daryl could feel the weight of it settling heavily on his shoulders. But he was ready, and he would not back down. The following morning, Daryl awoke with a weight on his chest that felt heavier than usual. As he looked out his window, his eyes immediately found the familiar, dark-tinted car parked across the street, its presence a silent reminder that whoever was watching him wasn't planning on leaving anytime soon. Angela's voice called from downstairs, interrupting his thoughts. "Daddy, breakfast is ready." Daryl took a deep breath, forcing a smile as he turned away from the window and made his way down to the kitchen. Angela was already sitting at the table, buttering toast while humming a tune he didn't recognize. She looked up as he entered, giving him a bright smile. "Good morning, Daddy." "Good morning, sweetie," he replied, trying to keep his tone light as he joined her. But his mind remained occupied, cycling through strategies on how to approach the growing threat. Angela tilted her head, studying him with a serious expression. "Are you still worried about work?" He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "A little bit, yeah. Sometimes work can get complicated." She looked at him thoughtfully, as if weighing his answer. "Well, maybe you need a break from it all. You could come watch me practice for the talent show after school." The invitation made Daryl smile in earnest this time. "I'd love that, Angela. Maybe I'll surprise you and bring some friends along to cheer you on." Angela grinned, clearly thrilled by the idea. "You better not be late, Daddy." Later that day, the hours dragged on as Daryl sat through meetings, all the while distracted by the constant surveillance outside his home and his family's safety. His next plan was to conduct surveillance of his own. He needed leverage, something that would force Regan and Maddox out of the shadows. But as the day wore on, an unexpected visitor arrived at the precinct. "Daryl," Lisa called from her office door, motioning him over. "There's someone here you'll want to meet." Daryl followed her down the hall to the small conference room, where a man with a grim expression sat waiting. Dressed in plain clothes, he appeared to be in his late 30s, with a rough edge that suggested he'd seen his fair share of dangerous situations. He stood as Daryl entered, extending his hand. "Detective Bennett, my name's Aaron Michaels. I'm an investigative reporter." Daryl's brow furrowed, taken aback. "A reporter?" Aaron nodded. "I've been following Paul Regan's activities for years. He's managed to avoid the spotlight, but I've collected more than enough evidence to suggest he's involved in corruption, and possibly worse. I reached out to your captain because I believe I can help you, if you're willing to trust me." Daryl studied him, feeling the weight of the risks involved. Bringing in an outsider, especially one connected to the media, could easily backfire, but Aaron's sincerity was hard to ignore. "What exactly do you have?" Daryl asked, folding his arms. Aaron took a deep breath, reaching into his bag and pulling out a thick file. "I have documents, witness statements, and a few leads that connect Regan's business interests to Maddox, and, more disturbingly, to a network of officers across multiple precincts who have been on his payroll. It's a conspiracy that goes deep, and Maddox's attack on your daughter may have been a warning." Daryl's jaw clenched as he thumbed through the file, the weight of the information sinking in. If Regan's influence reached that far, this was no ordinary case of corruption. Lisa watched their exchange, her expression serious. "This might be the break we need, Daryl, but it's your call." After a moment's consideration, Daryl nodded. "All right, Aaron, I'm listening. But if you're going to help us, I need you to understand that this goes beyond a story. This is my family's safety we're talking about." Aaron met his gaze, nodding sullenly. "I understand, Detective. I'm here to help bring Regan down, not to put your family at risk. Daryl took a deep breath, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Then let's get to work. That evening, true to his word, Daryl left work early and headed straight to Angela's school. The warm afternoon sunlight cast a glow over the playground as he approached, spotting her practicing a routine on the small stage set up for the talent show. She waved excitedly when she saw him, a huge smile lighting up her face. "Daddy, you made it," she called, running over to hug him. "Of course I did," he replied, hugging her back tightly. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." For the first time in days, Daryl felt a sense of peace as he watched Angela's classmates cheer each other on and laugh together. But his peace was short-lived as he noticed a familiar figure in the crowd watching from a distance. It was Maddox. Daryl's blood ran cold. Maddox had no reason to be here, especially after their last encounter. Yet there he was, his gaze fixed on Angela, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Daryl forced himself to remain calm, though every instinct told him to confront Maddox right then and there. Instead, he turned to Angela, keeping his tone light. "Angela, sweetheart, I need you to stay close to your friends, okay? Don't go anywhere without me." Angela frowned but nodded, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "Okay, Daddy." Daryl kept his eyes on Maddox, watching as the officer turned and disappeared into the crowd, his smirk lingering in Daryl's mind like a dark shadow. Back at the precinct, Daryl wasted no time. He gathered the files Aaron had given him and went straight to Lisa's office. They needed to escalate the investigation and start making arrests. But Daryl knew they had to be cautious. Regan's network was extensive, and any premature move could lead to backlash. "Lisa, we've got a serious problem," he said, closing the door behind him. "Maddox was at Angela's school today. I don't know what he was doing there, but it's clear he's not backing down." Lisa's face hardened. "That's a direct violation of the order we placed against him. I'll pull security footage and see if we can use it as grounds for immediate arrest." Daryl nodded, his jaw clenched. "And we need to act fast. If Maddox is still willing to show his face in public after what happened, that means he's getting desperate or bold." Lisa sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Let's get a task force on this. We need to be ready to make arrests, and I'll make sure there's a team dedicated to monitoring your home and Angela's school." Daryl's phone buzzed. He glanced down, his heart dropping as he read the message. "Unknown number. You think you're safe, Detective Bennett? You're making a mistake. I'll make sure you learn that the hard way." Daryl's hands tightened around his phone as he showed the message to Lisa, who frowned, her expression darkening. "They're escalating, Daryl," she said quietly. "And if Regan's involved, this won't end with simple threats." Daryl nodded, a fierce determination in his eyes. "Then we take the fight to them." Late that night, as Daryl drove home, the dark-tinted car was still there, parked in its usual spot. He parked his car a few houses down, choosing not to go directly to his home, in case he was being followed. Instead, he took a detour, circling the block a few times and watching the shadows for any movement. When he finally arrived home, he saw that the front door was ajar, swinging slightly in the night breeze. His heart pounded as he reached for his gun, moving silently up the porch steps. He entered slowly, his senses on high alert. Inside, everything appeared normal at first, but as he walked into the living room, he saw the unmistakable sign that someone had been there. A photo of him and Angela had been shattered, the glass scattered across the floor. A note lay beneath it, scrawled in harsh, bold letters. "Back off, or the next broken thing will be more than just a photo." Daryl's heart clenched, a cold fury surging through him as he picked up the note. Whoever had broken into his home had crossed a line that could not be ignored. This wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration of war. And Daryl Bennett was ready to fight. Daryl stared at the broken photo in his hands, the weight of the shattered glass matching the storm within him. This invasion was an audacious move, one meant to intimidate him into submission, but it had the opposite effect. If Regan and Maddox thought they could frighten him into backing down, they'd miscalculated. He spent the rest of the night securing the house, setting up temporary cameras at each entrance, and even placing a motion detector near Angela's room. The adrenaline kept him sharp, but every creak of the house seemed magnified, a reminder that his family was now the target of people with dangerous intent. By dawn, his exhaustion was replaced by a singular determination. He had enough evidence now to start connecting the dots between Regan's network and Maddox, but he knew he needed more to take it to the higher-ups. This couldn't just be a case of personal vendetta. It had to be a dismantling of corruption, all the way to its roots. Later that morning, after Angela left for school, Daryl called Lisa and arranged a meeting with Aaron Michaels, the investigative reporter, at a secure location outside the city. They met in a small diner, its faded wallpaper and cracked leather booths, making it a place few would suspect for planning the exposure of a high-powered criminal network. Aaron was already there, sipping coffee, his expression as tired as Daryl's. "I did some digging last night," he began, nodding as Daryl sat across from him. "I've got new details on Regan's ties with police departments across the county. He's been donating to police benevolent funds, but when I traced the money, I found that it's mostly ending up in the accounts of officers with misconduct charges, guys like Maddox." Daryl clenched his fists, absorbing the implications. So Regan's donations are basically hush money. Officers who toe the line get rewarded, and anyone who resists ends up, like my family. Aaron nodded grimly. "It's worse than that. I've heard rumors about a few incidents swept under the rug, a missing person case here, a suspicious suicide there, all linked to people who crossed Regan." The diner fell silent around them, as the two men let the weight of it settle in. This wasn't just corruption. It was a well-oiled machine of fear and control. "So what's our next move?" Daryl asked, his voice low. Aaron leaned forward, his eyes alight with the fire of a man committed to uncovering the truth. "We need an inside source, someone who knows the details of how Regan's operation works, but is scared enough to stay quiet. There are a few names I've come across, but one stands out: Tom Briscoe, a former officer. He left the force under strange circumstances, and from what I've gathered, he knows more than he's let on." Daryl's eyes narrowed. "Where is he?" Aaron glanced around, then leaned in closer. "Briscoe works as a night security guard at an old shipping yard. I say we pay him a visit tonight and see if he's willing to talk." Daryl nodded. If Briscoe had knowledge that could crack this case wide open, it was worth the risk. But he couldn't ignore the tight feeling in his chest, the sense that they were stepping into dangerous territory. That evening, Daryl parked his car a few blocks from the shipping yard, the streetlights casting long shadows over the deserted industrial area. Aaron arrived shortly after, nodding in acknowledgement before the two of them moved toward the fenced entrance. The yard was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of machinery and the rustle of the wind through the stacks of shipping containers. After a few minutes, they spotted Briscoe in a small, dimly lit guard booth near the main gate, his face illuminated by the soft glow of a reading lamp. He looked up as they approached, his eyes narrowing when he recognized Daryl's badge clipped to his jacket. "Look, I don't want any trouble," Briscoe muttered, his voice tense, as he put down the book he'd been reading. "We're not here to cause trouble, Tom," Daryl replied, his tone steady. "But we know you left the force under suspicious circumstances, and we think you know why Maddox and Regan are targeting people like me and my family." Briscoe's expression turned wary, his gaze darting between Daryl and Aaron. "Why shouldn't I trust either of you?" "Because we're not just looking to expose Regan," Aaron said, his voice low but intense. "We're here to bring him down. You know what he's capable of, but we also know he can't afford to let you talk. You help us, and we protect you." Briscoe hesitated, glancing down at his hands, before nodding slowly. "Fine, but we do this quickly. Regan's people have eyes everywhere." As they sat down in the booth, Briscoe kept his voice low, his gaze flicking around nervously. "I saw things on the force that didn't sit right. Regan, he's got a lot of friends in high places. He'd make donations to the precinct, and anyone who played along would get kickbacks. But if you crossed him, you'd find yourself either out of a job or, worse." "Go on," Daryl prompted, his tone steady. "There were some cops, good ones, who tried to report it. They were framed for crimes they didn't commit, forced out of their jobs. And those who stayed? They're terrified. They know Regan's power extends beyond the badge." Aaron took notes as Briscoe spoke, his pen moving quickly over the paper. "And Maddox? How does he fit into all of this?" Briscoe snorted. "Maddox is one of Regan's lackeys. He's been on the payroll for years, handling the dirty work. Regan uses him to keep people quiet, to send messages when someone gets too close." Daryl felt a surge of anger as he thought about Maddox's smirk at Angela's school, the twisted satisfaction of a man who knew he was untouchable. Is there proof? Darrell asked, his voice hard. Anything that ties Reagan directly to these threats? Briscoe glanced around again, as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. There's a safe house Reagan uses on the edge of town. He keeps records there. Files, recordings, the works. But it's heavily guarded. No one gets in or out without his permission. Darrell nodded, his mind already working on a plan. If they could get into that safe house and retrieve those records, they'd have all the proof they needed. Aaron leaned forward, a determined glint in his eyes. Then we go there. We gather what we need, and we expose him for everything he's done. But Briscoe's face turned pale, his voice trembling slightly. You don't understand. Regan doesn't just let things go. If he finds out you're after him, he'll come after you and everyone you care about. Darrell met his gaze, his expression unwavering. He already has, and he crossed a line that he won't be able to come back from. Briscoe looked away, taking a deep breath before nodding. All right, I'll help you, but you'll need to be ready for whatever comes next. Early the next morning, Darrell left a note for Lisa detailing the meeting with Briscoe and the plan to obtain evidence from Regan's safe house. He couldn't involve her directly, it was too dangerous, but he knew she needed to be aware of what was happening. Before he left, he checked on Angela, who was still sleeping peacefully in her room. He stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment as a sense of fierce protectiveness filled him. Everything he was doing, every risk he was taking, was for her future, for her safety. As he stepped back into the hallway, his phone buzzed with a message from Aaron. Ready when you are. Darrell typed a quick reply and slipped the phone into his pocket. Today would be a turning point, one way or another. As he exited the house and stepped into the dawn, he had no idea that shadows were moving closer, that Regan's network had already sensed the shift, preparing to strike back. The sun hung low in the sky as Darrell pulled into the parking lot of the rundown motel where Aaron had arranged to meet Briscoe. The air was thick with tension, and the buzzing of flies around the entrance added to the uneasy atmosphere. Darrell parked his car and glanced around, noting the absence of other vehicles. It felt like the calm before a storm. As he stepped out of the car, a low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, reminding him that the weather mirrored his internal turmoil. He pushed the door open, the hinges squeaking in protest, and walked into the dimly lit lobby. The clerk barely acknowledged him as he made his way through the musty air to the back where the meeting room was located. Inside, Aaron was already there, pacing the small space. Briscoe sat at a table in the corner, his face tight with anxiety. Hey, what's going on? Darrell asked, sitting down next to Aaron. I spoke to Briscoe a bit more, Aaron said, his voice low. He's given me some details about the safe house, but it's clear he's nervous. He thinks we're walking into a trap. Briscoe nodded, glancing around as if he expected someone to burst in at any moment. Regan's people are everywhere. If they know you're coming for him, they'll be ready. We need to be smart about this. Darrell felt a wave of frustration. We can't let fear stop us from doing what's right. We're going to get that evidence. Briscoe swallowed hard. I want to help, but we need a solid plan. If we just walk in there, we'll get caught. Let's outline the details, Aaron suggested, pulling out a notepad. What do we know about the layout? Briscoe took a deep breath. It's a 2-story building, fairly isolated. There's an entrance in the front, but it's usually guarded. There's a back entrance that leads into the main office, but I've seen guards posted there too. We need to create a distraction to get inside. Darrell nodded, feeling the gears of strategy turning in his mind. What about surveillance? Are there cameras? Only outside as far as I know, Briscoe replied, but they have a security system inside that could be triggered if we're not careful. Aaron scribbled down notes, his brow furrowing. If we can create a diversion and slip in through the back, we might be able to get to the records without anyone noticing. Okay, Darrell said, determined. What do we need for the diversion? Briscoe rubbed the back of his neck, visibly uncomfortable. I can set off the fire alarm. I used to know how to work it when I was still with the department. Aaron's eyes widened. That could work, but we need to time it right. If we're going to take this chance, we need to be in and out quickly. Then let's do it, Darrell said, adrenaline pumping through him. We're running out of time. Regan won't wait for us to catch our breath. Later that night, Darrell, Aaron, and Briscoe drove to the safe house, parked a few blocks away, and huddled in the shadows of the alley. The old building loomed before them, its exterior battered and worn, but a sense of danger hung thick in the air. Daryl could feel the tension in his muscles as he prepared for what lay ahead. Remember, once we're in, we'll have a limited window before anyone realizes the fire alarm has been triggered, Aaron whispered, glancing at his watch. We need to stick together. Daryl nodded, his heart racing. Let's go. They approached the back entrance, where a door hung slightly ajar, and Briscoe motioned for them to follow him inside. The hallway was dark and narrow, the sound of their footsteps echoing ominously against the walls. Now, Briscoe hissed as he slid to the front of the group and reached for the fire alarm. He pulled the lever down, and a loud siren blared through the building. Go! Go! Daryl shouted, pushing through the door that led to the main office area. He could hear commotion erupting from elsewhere in the building as people scrambled to exit. The sirens continued to wail, but there was no time to lose. They dashed into the office, a cluttered space filled with papers and boxes stacked haphazardly. Briscoe led the way, heading to a locked filing cabinet in the corner. I'll need a minute, he said, fumbling with the lock. Daryl and Aaron kept watch, ears tuned to the sound of footsteps. Adrenaline surged through him, and he felt a mix of fear and determination. They were close to uncovering everything, and failure was not an option. Come on, come on, Briscoe muttered under his breath, working frantically on the lock. Suddenly, the sound of boots thudding against the floor echoed from the hallway, growing louder. They're coming, Aaron hissed, eyes wide with panic. Just a little longer, Briscoe urged, desperation evident in his voice. Daryl's heart raced as he peeked through the door. He could see shadows moving, figures approaching the office. He pulled his weapon, ready to defend their position if necessary. We need to move. With a final click, Briscoe swung the cabinet open, revealing a trove of documents. Got it, he exclaimed, pulling out files and handing them to Aaron. Daryl turned, prepared to cover their escape, but the door slammed open. A figure stood there, Maddox, flanked by two other officers. His face twisted into a cruel smile. Going somewhere, detective? Maddox sneered, drawing his gun. Daryl's heart sank, adrenaline flooding his system as the reality of their situation crashed down on him. They were trapped in the chaos. Get back, Maddox shouted, his voice echoing through the office. Daryl felt a surge of anger as he realized how close they had come to succeeding. Out the back, he shouted to Aaron and Briscoe, pushing them toward the rear exit. I'll hold them off. No, we need to stick together, Aaron protested, but Daryl knew what had to be done. Go, now, he commanded, aiming his gun at Maddox, who was still smirking, confident in his advantage. The two men dashed out of the office, as Daryl kept his focus on Maddox. Time seemed to stretch as he faced the man who had terrorized his family, and all the anger and frustration he had bottled up came rushing forth. Do you really think you can threaten my family and get away with it? Daryl shouted, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Maddox took a step forward, his expression a mix of amusement and contempt. You think you're the hero in this story, don't you? But the truth is, you're just another pawn in a game you can't hope to win. With that, Maddox lunged at him, gun drawn. The confrontation exploded into chaos as Daryl dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the bullet that rang out. He scrambled to regain his footing, feeling the tension crackle in the air as the two men faced off. Stop, Maddox shouted, but Daryl wasn't about to back down. This was more than just a fight. It was a battle for his family's safety, for everything that had been taken from him. The sound of footsteps behind him made Daryl glance back briefly, hoping to catch sight of Aaron and Briscoe. They needed to make it out safely, but he couldn't let Maddox escape either. You're nothing without your badge, Maddox taunted, closing the distance. You think this little stunt will change anything? Reagan will crush you. Daryl's heart raced as he dodged Maddox's lunge, the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He felt the weight of his weapon in his hands, a reminder of everything that was at stake. Maybe it's time someone put a stop to your games, Daryl shouted, his voice steady as he aimed his gun. And then it happened. A gunshot rang out, echoing through the office as Daryl pulled the trigger. But it wasn't Maddox who fell. The shot struck the ground near the entrance, startling both men. A figure stepped into the doorway, silhouetted by the dim light of the hallway, an officer in full gear, standing firmly with their weapon drawn. Detective Bennett, drop your weapon, they commanded, their voice firm. Daryl's heart raced as he realized he was surrounded. The realization hit him hard, a sinking feeling of betrayal coursing through his veins. Regan had managed to infiltrate his own precinct, and now they were trapped. Maddox laughed, the sound echoing around them. "Looks like you're out of options, Detective. Your little rebellion ends here." Daryl's mind raced. He couldn't let them take him without a fight, but the odds were stacked against him. Every instinct screamed for him to escape, to protect Angela and everything he held dear. Suddenly, the officer stepped forward, their eyes locked onto Daryl. "I don't want to do this, Bennett, but you need to cooperate." Daryl felt a surge of desperation. "You don't understand. They're corrupt. They're working with Regan." But the officers shook their head, raising their weapon. "I said drop it." As Daryl weighed his options, his thoughts raced back to Angela, to the promise he had made to protect her. He couldn't let this moment define him. He had to make a choice. He dropped his weapon, the clatter of metal ringing in the air as it hit the floor. But inside, a fire ignited. He wouldn't go down without a fight, and he would find a way to turn the tide. With the officer momentarily distracted, he seized the opportunity. He lunged forward, knocking the weapon from their hands and spinning them around, using their own momentum against them. "Run!" Daryl shouted to Aaron and Briscoe, who were still outside. They bolted, but the moment stretched, an intense standoff looming before them. Daryl knew they had to get out of there. Regan's people were closing in, and failure was no longer an option. As chaos erupted, Daryl fought against the officer, adrenaline propelling him forward. He could feel Maddox moving in the shadows, ready to strike again. But he couldn't think about that now. He had to focus on escaping. "Get the files!" he yelled at Aaron, who had been frozen in shock. But the moment was fleeting, a whirlwind of confusion. The air was thick with tension, every second feeling like an eternity. Daryl felt the officer's grip tighten, and he knew he had to act fast. With a swift move, he twisted freed from the officer's grasp, his heart racing as he dashed toward the exit. The sound of footsteps echoed behind him, urgency driving him forward. "Keep moving," Aaron shouted, urgency coloring his voice. Daryl could see the dim light of freedom ahead, the way out calling to him like a beacon. He pushed through the door, bursting into the night air. The adrenaline surged as he sprinted, urging Aaron and Briscoe to keep up. They needed to reach the car, but the chaos behind them signaled that Regan's network wasn't far behind. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the night, followed by the shattering of glass. Daryl glanced back to see a group of officers rushing out of the building, weapons drawn, the sirens blaring in the distance. "We need to split up," he yelled, knowing their best chance at escaping was to confuse their pursuers. "Are you crazy?" Aaron shouted, panic evident in his voice. "We stick together." But Daryl's mind was racing, calculating their next move. "They'll be looking for 3 of us. If we split, we might have a better chance." Briscoe nodded, fear and determination mixing in his eyes. "He's right. We can't let them catch us all." Daryl felt a mix of regret and resolve as they prepared to part ways. "All right, we meet back at my house in an hour. No matter what, don't go home." "Be careful," Aaron urged, his expression filled with concern. "You too," Daryl replied, steeling himself as they moved into the shadows. With one last glance back, Daryl took off in the opposite direction, feeling the weight of the night bearing down on him. Every step felt like a race against time, against everything he stood for. As he sprinted through the alleyways, Daryl's heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline fueling his escape. He knew he couldn't look back. Every instinct screamed for him to push forward. But just as he rounded a corner, he found himself face to face with another group of officers. Panic surged within him, and he quickly ducked into an alcove, his breath shallow and quick. He could hear their voices, the tension palpable as they searched for him. "He must be around here somewhere." One of them growled, "We need to find him before Regan gets word." Regan, the name hung heavy in the air, a reminder of everything that was at stake. As they moved closer, Daryl felt the weight of desperation crash over him. He had to get home, had to protect Angela, but the walls were closing in. He knew he needed to find a way out, but every route he considered felt like a dead end. The night air was thick with danger, and Daryl could feel the pressure mounting, the walls of his world narrowing. In that moment of uncertainty, a figure stepped into the shadows beside him, startling him. "Bennett?" The voice whispered urgently. It was a woman he recognized, Officer Melanie Reed, someone he'd worked with before. "What are you doing here?" he asked, surprise mingling with relief. "I heard about what was happening," she said, glancing back toward the searching officers. "I couldn't let you face this alone. Regan's got too much power. We need to take him down together." Daryl felt a glimmer of hope spark within him. "I'm trying to get to my family. They're at risk." "I'll help you," Melanie said, her eyes fierce with determination. "But we need to be careful. They're everywhere." Daryl nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "Let's move." Together, they slipped into the maze of alleyways, navigating the dark streets with a sense of urgency. The odds were still stacked against them, but they wouldn't let fear control their fate. As they approached the edge of the neighborhood, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance, a reminder that time was running out. "We need to find a safe place to regroup," Melanie said, glancing around. "There's an old warehouse a few blocks from here," Daryl replied. "It might be a good place to hide out for a while." "Lead the way," she urged, determination shining in her eyes. With every step, Daryl felt the weight of their mission settle over him. They were fighting against an enemy that threatened not just their lives, but the lives of everyone they loved. But as they moved deeper into the shadows, he knew one thing for certain. They would not stop until Regan was brought to justice. They would face whatever came next, together. And just as they reached the warehouse, a loud crash echoed through the night, the sound of tires screeching to a halt. Daryl's heart sank as he glanced back, the realization dawning on him that they were not safe yet. The headlights of multiple vehicles lit up the street, illuminating the figures of officers stepping out, weapons drawn. Maddox stood at the forefront, a smug smile plastered across his face. "Looks like you thought you could escape," he taunted, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "But you're not getting away from me." Daryl felt a surge of anger and determination. They had come too far to let fear dictate their fate. "We'll see about that," he growled, his instincts kicking into overdrive. With Melanie at his side, he prepared for what was to come. They would fight to protect their loved ones, fight to expose the corruption that had taken root in their lives. As the night closed in around them, Daryl steeled himself for the battle ahead, knowing that the ultimate confrontation was only just beginning. The air crackled with tension as Daryl and Melanie faced off against Maddox, and the officers gathered around them. The moment felt surreal, like a scene from a movie where the hero stood against overwhelming odds. But this was real life, and the stakes couldn't be higher. "Time to end this," Maddox sneered, stepping forward with his weapon raised. The officers behind him shifted, eager for the fight to begin. Daryl's mind raced as he glanced at Melanie. "We have to create a distraction," he whispered, formulating a plan on the fly. They needed to give themselves a chance to escape, or at least, make it out of this mess alive. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Daryl grabbed a nearby rock and hurled it toward a pile of trash bins across the street. The loud crash echoed, drawing the attention of the officers. "Go," he shouted to Melanie as he took off in the opposite direction. "Daryl, wait," Melanie called, but he was already running, heart pounding in his chest. He sprinted down the alley, knowing he couldn't let Maddox catch up to them. The sounds of shouting and chaos erupted behind him as the officers scrambled to regroup. Just when Daryl thought he might lose them, he spotted a narrow side street that led to the back of a neighboring building. Without hesitating, he veered into the alleyway, pushing himself to run faster. Meanwhile, Melanie wasn't far behind. She followed Daryl's lead, weaving through the shadows. The adrenaline coursed through her veins as she heard the officers yelling behind them. They had no choice but to keep moving forward. "Stay close," she shouted to Daryl, who was already darting into another alley. Together, they navigated the maze of buildings, searching for a way to outsmart their pursuers. They knew they had to find a way to warn Angela and the others. There was no telling what Maddox would do if he got his hands on them. As they reached a more open area, Daryl finally stopped to catch his breath, peering around the corner. He spotted a small park where families often gathered during the day, but now it was deserted. "We need to get to my car," he panted, scanning the area for any sign of danger. Melanie nodded, determination etched on her face. "We'll make it, but we have to be careful. They'll be looking for us everywhere." With caution, they moved through the park, staying low and out of sight. The sirens still echoed in the distance, a constant reminder that they were not safe yet. As they reached the edge of the park, they spotted Daryl's car parked a few feet away, the headlights dim but still functional. Just as they approached, a vehicle screeched to a halt nearby, and the sound sent panic coursing through Daryl's veins. He recognized the car. It was Regan's. The man who had instigated this whole nightmare was here. "Get in," he yelled to Melanie, throwing open the door and jumping into the driver's seat. She hopped in beside him, and they slammed the doors just as Regan's henchman spilled out of the car. "Drive, drive," Melanie urged, and Daryl turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and he floored the gas pedal, sending them speeding out of the park and onto the road. As they sped away, the adrenaline surged through him like a drug. Daryl's mind was racing. They needed to find a place to regroup, somewhere safe to plan their next move. "We can't go home," he said, glancing at Melanie. "Regan will be looking for us there." "Let's head to my old friend's place," she suggested. "He runs a safe house for people in trouble. It'll be a good place to lay low." "Good idea," Daryl agreed, weaving through traffic as he followed Melanie's directions. They drove through the city, the weight of the night pressing down on them as they tried to outrun their pursuers. Eventually, they arrived at the safe house, a nondescript building in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by tall trees that offered a sense of security. Daryl parked quickly, his heart still racing. "Let's go," he urged, glancing nervously around for any sign of trouble. As they approached the door, a figure stepped out, surprised but quickly recognizing them. "Daryl, what happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Long story," Daryl said, breathless. "We need to hide out for a while. Can you help us?" "Of course," the man replied, ushering them inside. "Come on, you're safe here." Inside the safe house, Daryl and Melanie collapsed into chairs, finally able to catch their breath. "What's the plan now?" Melanie asked, her voice steady but her eyes betraying her exhaustion. "We need to gather evidence against Regan and Maddox," Daryl replied. "We can't let them get away with this. They need to be held accountable." Melanie nodded, determination flaring in her eyes. "I have contacts in the department who might be willing to help. If we can gather enough evidence, we could take them down." Daryl felt a surge of hope at her words. "Let's do it. We can't stop until we've exposed the truth." As they began to formulate their plan, the phone rang suddenly, cutting through the tension. Daryl's heart raced as he reached for the receiver. "Hello?" "Daryl, it's Angela," came the voice on the other end. "Angela, thank God," he exclaimed, relief flooding through him. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, but they came looking for you. They said you were in danger." Her voice trembled, and he could hear the worry behind her words. "I know, I'm with a friend, and we're safe for now. But we need to talk. Can you meet us?" "Where?" she asked. "Stay put. I'll come to you," Daryl said, determination flooding through him. "Be careful," Angela warned. "I will. I promise," he replied before hanging up. As he turned to Melanie, "Angela's safe, but we need to meet her," he said. "If we can bring her into this plan, we might have a fighting chance." "Let's go," Melanie replied, her eyes fierce with determination. They moved quickly, ready to face whatever came next. The fight wasn't over, and Daryl knew they needed to stay one step ahead of Regan and Maddox. As they prepared to leave, Daryl felt a sense of purpose swell within him. He had faced darkness and danger, but he wouldn't back down. They would fight for justice, for their families, and for a future free from fear. In the end, Daryl's journey was just beginning. He would not rest until he brought Regan's empire crumbling down. Together with Melanie and Angela, they would expose the truth and restore hope to their lives. As they stepped into the night, ready to face the challenges ahead, Daryl felt a renewed sense of strength. No matter what obstacles lay before them, they would confront them together. Together, they would rise.